Okay, should we make a start?
Yeah, sure.
Let's make a start. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to this book launch for the People, Left Populism in Spain and the US. Jorge's wonderful book, there you go. Spine, back, front, there we are. So my name's Catherine Fletcher. I'm the books editor at Lawrence and Wishart Publishers. We're a radical publisher of books on politics and culture, and we've been publishing continuously since 1936. And we're immensely pleased to be publishing this book, whose subject matter couldn't be more urgent and relevant in today's volatile political world. And we're very pleased to be welcoming to speak tonight, not only the book's author, Jorge Tomas, but a very distinguished authority on left populism, among many other subjects, Professor Chantal Mouffe. Jorge has been an exemplary author to work with, an excellent natural writer, and he's also been very efficient and patient with our editorial questions, which we like. His subject matter, populism, is both timely and not well understood. Many people might think they know what populism is, but what Jorge shows us in his book, against a commonly negative view of the phenomenon, is the radical progressive potential of a populism of the left. So the evening's going to go as follows. After my brief introduction, Chantal will speak for around 10 minutes about the importance and value of this book. And then she'll hand over to Jorge, who will speak for a further 10 or 15 minutes. And he'll outline the book's argument and what his case studies of the Bernie Sanders movement in the US and Podemos in Spain can tell us about the prospects and possibilities of left populism more broadly. Throughout the session, it'll be possible to use the chat function to post your comments and questions. If you haven't used this before, it should appear at the bottom of your screen and you just click in it and write your message in the box. If it's a question you'd like to ask for either Jorge or Chantal, please could you type it in capital letters, including who it's for, and then at the end I'll be able to ask them the question. So we'll have about half an hour after the speeches in which I'll ask the questions to each of the speakers. And please, if you can, don't unmute yourself until the very end when we'll have a chance to thank the speakers. And also don't forget that if you'd like to buy the book for a special discount, look out for the discount code you'll have got with your invitation to Zoom, and it'll also appear in the chat later on. So we'll move on to the speakers. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Chantal Mouffe, who's Professor Emeritus of Political Theory at the Centre for Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster. She has taught and researched in many universities in Europe, North America and South America, and is a corresponding member of the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris. She is the author of several books, including most recently, Agonistics, Thinking the World Politically from 2013, Podemos in the Name of the People, which was published by us in 2016, and co-authored with Íñigo Errejón, who was until recently a major figure in Podemos itself, and For a Left Populism, which was published last year. Chantal, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. So good evening to everybody. Well, I'm just going to give a few points for which I think that this book is really important. Well, first, as Catherine has indicated, everybody speaks about populism, but there is no general definition. Of course, there is the media view, which is, they call populist everything that they don't like, so without any content. But even if we think of the discussion about populism among political theorists, we in principle should be a bit more serious about, we find that they practically all of them, and this is why I think the book by Jorge Tomas is really interesting. They have a very negative view of populism, which basically they start from the idea that populism is right-wing populism. And there are many different, in fact, there is a whole industry of populism, but what they've got in common is that they think there is something, the populism, that can be defined. It's some kind of a doctrine, it's an ideology, and in different ways, of course, because everybody wants to be more original, but we can say that the main argument of all those books, by political theorists, is that populism is a doctrine which it constitutes basically the idea of there's an opposition between the people, which the people is good, is pure, and against the opposition or the elite, basically, which is corrupted, and so this is basically they say it's a moralistic view of politics, you know, the good people against the corrupted elite. And they say that in consequences, and that is a thesis that we find in all of them, populism is anti-democratic and it is anti-pluralistic. You know, this is the main thing. And I think that the book of Tamames is very different from that, because of course he follows a very different interpretation. For him, there is not such a thing like, you know, the populism, an ideology, a doctrine that can be defined. He insists very much that populism is a discursive strategy of construction of the political frontier. And of course, it means that the frontier can be constructed in many different ways. One of them, of course, is the one that, you know, is accused of being the moralistic view, the pure people against the corrupted elite. But it's only one of them. And one cannot just say, this is what populism is about, you know. There are, in fact, many different forms of populism. And that's why one can really distinguish between right-wing populism and left-wing populism. So Tamames follow what is a discursive conception of politics and a discursive conception of what populism is. But I think that what is really new and original in his approach is that he insists on the need, when one is going to study the different conjuncture in which populist movement evolve, because of course, if you start from the idea that, you know, there are different constructions of populism, if you are interested in understanding one form of populism, you need to examine what is the conjuncture in which this movement emerged. And of course, he's in his book, especially, I mean, almost exclusively, I would say, interested in recent form of populist movement in the West. So this is and particularly is going to give two examples, Bernie Sanders in the US and Podemos in Spain. But he insists, and I think that's really important and new, that populism need to be understood in the context of political economy. You know, one needs to envisage first, adopt what they call a long-term approach, because populism is not something that happened because there is suddenly some kind of demagogue, you know. It's really a process, and we are going to see what is really specific about that process. So it's a long-term approach that takes political economy into consideration. I think that's crucial. It's the center of its analysis, yeah? And as I say, he's basically interested to understand the recent form of Western populism. And he said that they need to be seen in the socio-economic context of the advance of neoliberalism since the 1970s. You know, this is, you cannot understand the emergence of all the populist movement if you do not examine what has happened since the 70s and the development of neoliberalism. And he said that different forms of populism are a response to the economic transformation which have been due to neoliberal globalization and the consequences of those transformations for the political politics, for the popular classes and for the middle classes. So it's really, you know, understand that in the context of the transformation, basically the rise of neoliberalism, the destruction of the welfare state, all that is a process to which populist movement, both of the right and the left, but of course in different ways, are reacting. And then, and that is another very important element of the book, which I think makes its real originality, is that Tamames articulates this discursive view with the conception that one finds in Karl Polanyi of the counter movement. I want to say a little bit about the counter movement because it's absolutely crucial in his analysis. In his book, The Great Transformation, Polanyi examining, you know, what has happened. Of course, it's a different conjuncture. It's what has happened in the 30s, and he said that what should see what happened, the movement that happened in the 30s as a counter-movement, resistance of society against the consequences of what can be called the first globalization, the beginning of the commodification, the advances of the market, the first moment in which the market pushes in order to transform your land, work, and into commodities. And what is, I find particularly interesting and very relevant for our situation today is that Polanyi shows, in fact, this movement, this counter-movement is a movement of self-protection of society against the destruction, of the relation between the economy and social needs. So it's an attempt to restore the relation between economy and social needs. So this is the way in which he envisaged the movement took place in the 30s. But, and that's absolutely crucial, he insists that this movement of resistance, of self-protection of society is not going to take the necessarily democratic forms. Of course, in the case of the New Deal with Roosevelt, it was democratic in the sense that it was redistributive and advance of democracy. But on the other side, there's another way in which this counter-movement took place, which is fascism and Nazism, and of course, he also make reference to the fact of Stalinism. So I think that, the society wants to protect itself against the consequences of commodification. Well, and in fact, what Tamames shows is that this phenomenon of development of contemporary populist movement is to be understood as a counter-movement of society against the consequences of the development of neoliberalism, of neoliberal globalization, the consequences that it has in the deterioration in the condition of work of the popular classes to begin with, but also after the 2008 crisis, the fact that those deterioration also began to affect middle classes, So, and this is why, in fact, those populist movements of the left, developed mainly in starting from 2011. So basically, after the 2008 crisis, as a consequence, resistance against the form of the position of political austerity. So, you see that it's very interesting because it really situates the development of those movements in a socioeconomic context. And also, I think what is crucial here is that he also insists that the situation today is similar to the one in which Polanyi was thinking in this aspect, that it can, and it is in fact going, leading to two forms of movement of self-protection. One that takes position, more regressive, and it's a recuperation of the democracy, because one could also say that they are resistances against the post-democratic situation, which has been a consequence of the development of neoliberalism. But this struggle against post-democracy can take the form of some kind of nationalistic, xenophobic movement, and this is what right-wing populism is about. But it can also take a form of left-wing populism, which is to recover democracy, but in order to deepen and to extend it. And of course, that is going to be seen in the different ways in which the people is constructed. Right-wing populism is some kind of immunitary form of nationalism, the nationalism that want to really limit itself to the good, the citizen. For people who are born in the country, let's say basically the immigrants are not part of it, while in the case of left-wing populism, of course, it's much more inclusive. So I think that really is important because it does allow us to understand the rise of those populist movements in a way which neither of all those books written by political theorists or political scientists. It helps us to understand what is the origin of those movements, how they and also the fact that they are not short-term phenomenon. They are things that have all development. This counter movement is not just a big shift; it's something that take place over some time. And this argument, I think, is important in order to answer one of the things which is often said, and that's the last point I'm going to make. We have heard recently, after the fact that well, neither Bernie Sanders nor Jeremy Corbyn, for instance, who are clearly example of left-wing populism, have been able to reach their goal. And in fact, Tamames, who studies basically the case of Podemos, as I say, and Bernie Sanders, also acknowledge, they have not yet really managed to reach their goal. But this is not something that we can, okay, so then left populism is finished, because this is what we are hearing. Left populism is finished, it's a parenthesis, the time is finished for them. It's too late. Now we've got to, according to some people, come back to some more traditional conception of the left. Well, I think that once we understand we can, thanks to the analysis of Tamames, populism and those populist movements, something as a counter movement, well, to the crisis of neoliberalism. Look, the crisis of liberalism is not finished. We are still very much in the middle of the crisis of neoliberalism. And in fact, we could argue that the coronavirus crisis has exacerbated the crisis of neoliberalism. So it's not that things are getting better now. The contrary, they are really, let's say, if we go back to business as usual, as people say we are going, well, that was a moment of crisis. So I think that we are still in the counter movement. So the idea that left-wing populism is finished, in fact, it's based on a misunderstanding of this strategy, a strategy that, and a misunderstanding of the populist moment. Like populism moment is a moment, that you've got to seize the opportunity, or if not, it's lost. Well, this is not at all the way in which the strategy of left populism should be understood. It's not a moment, it's something, it's more on the basis of what Gramsci called a war of position. It's not a war of maneuver. And it is something, it's a counter movement. This counter movement is still very much going on, because the crisis, of neoliberalism is, as I was saying, is far from finished. And in fact, what is crucial is for the left not to leave this counter movement to be driven by right-wing populism. Because if we say the left populist movement is finished, then it means that this counter movement is going to be driven exclusively for right-wing populism. So to conclude, what I think is really important in this book, in my view, is the fact that contrary to most of the studies we've been seeing recently about populism, and there are many of them, this is a book that really helps us to understand the reason for the development of populism, but also more importantly, and I will say in a sense, also to envisage how we can, struggle against that. What will be a strategy to impede the development of the movement? Because if you start from the traditional view, the only way you can say something against those right-wing populist movement is moral condemnation, to establishment of a sanitary cordon. But you can't imagine, what we, the left, could do in order to fight against them. Simply moral condemnation, okay, but that's not going to stop them. While thanks to Tamames, who show really, what's at stake in this movement, then we can begin to imagine how we can organize and fight against the rise of right-wing populism and impede that this counter movement, the counter movement is going to go on. But who is driving that? This is the main question, And so it's important for the left to take charge of that and drive the counter movement in a way in which it is going to lead to a deepening of democracy and not to more restrictive democracy.
Thank you very much, Chantal. Thank you. And now we'll turn to Jorge, the author of the book. Jorge Tomas is a PhD candidate at University College Dublin and managing editor at Politica Exterior. His writing has appeared in El País, Jacobin, and The New Statesman. He previously was based in New England, and he now lives between Spain and Ireland. Jorge, please go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks for having me, and thanks, Kate, Catherine, and Chantal for your immense help along the way, which has made this book much better than I would think that the original drafts were. It's a pleasure to be here, and so I'll just summarize a bit what the book is about in line with what Chantal just said. For the People is basically, indeed, it's an analysis of left populism from the standpoint of political economy. And the origin of this project was I was studying a master's in Boston, and I lived between the United States and Madrid, right? So this was 2017, and I was very surprised to see how in both countries in the same period of time, the 2014 to 2015, two very similar movements appeared. So in Spain, it was Podemos, right? The sort of anti-austerity left populist party. And in the US, it was the 2016 and then 2020 campaigns of Bernie Sanders. In two very different societies, these two movements had something in common. One was that they were clearly very progressive, but they articulated their demands or their campaign and their needs, their strategies in a different language from the sort of like business as usual traditional parties, right? The other is that against the odds at the beginning, they were hugely successful, right? So Bernie Sanders initially launched his campaign as sort of a campaign that wanted to raise awareness of certain issues, but he got close to disputing the nomination against Clinton in 2016 and against Joe Biden in 2020. And Podemos, who in its first elections won 8% of the vote and was sort of dismissed as a fringe party, came close to overtaking the Socialist Party in Spain as the main party of the Spanish left. So, in fact, what led me to write about both of these parties was that, like Chantal said, I found the coverage of their appearance sort of infuriating or very disappointing. In most mainstream media accounts, the way that populism is presented, there are two tropes that are very common. One is to basically equate populism that is progressive, populism on the left, to radical right populism, right? So there was a bit of this in the US, right? So if you talk about economic inequality, or if you say that, if you take too seriously the grievances that some Trump voters have expressed, then you're the same as Trump, right? Bernie got tagged with this sort of, his supporters were criticized as Bernie bros and so forth. And in Spain, it was very similar. Like Podemos was equated with the French far right, for example, because they talked about reclaiming economic sovereignty and so forth. So I think, you know, as I'll discuss further on, I think there are similarities in that both are populist, both these kinds of movements, for different reasons though. But they're not the same, obviously, they're very different. And then the other thing was very shallow coverage of populism in general, where there's a huge focus on what populist leaders say and sort of this immediate scandal of whatever they say in a given day, but not a lot of what they actually do or what they represent in larger terms, right? And you see this a lot with coverage on Trump, right? Which is basically one scandal to the other and not really like a deep analysis of the policies he does, which are not really very different from that of a traditional Republican. So in academic terms, it's a similar story. A lot of the leading academic accounts of populism presented as an ideology, like Chantal said. So populists, apparently they believe to represent the people are pure, and they fight against elites who are impure and so forth. Now, I think this is a very sort of a condescending way to describe populist parties, both on the left and on the right, to be honest, for two reasons. One is that this sort of rhetoric play where you identify your voters as the people is something that parties do all the time, right? Conservative parties that only represent a small minority of the electorate constantly present what they're going to do as an agenda that is beneficial for everyone and that everyone actually claims for. And so this is not something that is new or particularly like, it's not just something that populist parties and leaders do. The other thing is, okay, assuming that populism was in fact an ideology, and like Chantal said, it's not a view that I subscribe to. Well, then what begs an explanation is why has it triumphed at this particular point in time and not say 20 or 30 years ago, right? And I think there's an obvious case to be made that, look, there's, you know, these parties and movements on the left and on the right have triumphed in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, which in Europe then lagged on until 2012, 2015, more or less, due to the austerity measures that were applied. And so maybe it could be, you could make the case that maybe these parties and movements actually have a relationship to events that are happening in the economy. So there's a political scientist called Paul Pearson. He makes a really interesting comparison of political phenomena with weather events. So most accounts of populism are what he would call a tornado. So a tornado forms instantly, causes instant damage, and then vanishes, right? And that's the idea that most mainstream academic and media accounts give of populists on the right and left. They suddenly appear, they're demagogues, they dupe their voters, and then, you know, once they're gone or they're out of the picture, we can go on to life as usual. Now, Pearson has another analogy, which is an earthquake, right? So an earthquake, like a tornado, has immediate effects, and they're very noticeable. But the causes of an earthquake take very long to develop. So tectonic plates are rumbling for years and decades until suddenly the earthquake breaks out. And this is sort of what I argued that is what has happened in the last 10 years in Europe and the United States. Now, to look at those tectonic plates, you actually need to look at the economy and how it has worked for most people over the course of the last 4 decades. And here's where I find really useful the work of Karl Polanyi. Karl Polanyi was a Austro-Hungarian political economist who in the 1940s wrote The Great Transformation. And basically, as Chantal says, what he posits is that people resent having key aspects of their life managed by market mechanisms, right? It's okay to go to the market and buy oranges, but people don't like their labor being treated the same way as a commodity, in the way that you can pull down the price in oranges and the oranges won't mind, but people do mind if their labor power, if they are paid less for what they do and so forth, right? Land is another example of a commodity that we present as something that you can buy and sell, but as we see from the ongoing climate crisis, is not. You can't treat our natural environment like it was just another economic asset. So what he posited is that in fact, society almost spontaneously ends up pushing against the dynamic where more and more relations become governed by the market logic. And what is interesting is that in the mechanism that he presented, it's first society that pushes back spontaneously, and eventually it's political parties or political movements that pick up on these demands. Now, as Chantal said, like the demands don't need to be democratic. The demands to, as he would say, re-embed the economy and social needs in the 1940s produced the New Deal, but they also produced fascism and Stalinism, right? But the question is that the fact that it's first socially driven movement is very interesting because it really pertains to what has happened in Spain and the US since the outbreak of the crisis. So in Spain, before the appearance of Podemos, you had a massive movement, the 15 March in 2011, Indignados, the sort of outraged movement of people who flooded the streets to protest against the way that the economy was being handled, of the effects of the crisis on unemployment and also the austerity measures that were being imposed. And this was a spontaneous movement that was not exactly a working class led movement in the way that maybe like an orthodox Marxist could be led to expect, but that was very powerful and that garnered amazing support, even though its demands were very clearly to the left. A lot of people in Spain who were not, would not identify as leftists or even on the right agreed with their demands, right? Which were for a way out of the crisis with more social justice and less budget cuts and less, let's say, less punishing settlement for those who were in a weaker position within society. And in the US, you had the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? So movements like Podemos and the Bernie Sanders campaigns fed on a lot of the rhetoric that had been created by these movements before, right? So the idea of the 99% versus the 1%, right? And so I think this is like basically the framework that Polanyi provides is very useful to understand the way in which, the reason that these parties have appeared and how that relates to the crisis. Now, to be clear, I don't make the case that it's just the crisis that made them appear. If you really take a serious look at the way our political economies are governed, you notice that the crisis accelerated trends that were already underway, but they've been underway since basically the 1970s, when the original post-war model of, let's say, a more social democratic capitalism, right, with full employment and more unionized workforces gave way to what we call neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is a bit of a word that is like populism in that sometimes it's used a bit loosely to condemn all things that you don't like economic, but it basically means an economic arrangement where the imperatives of international markets are what really need to be taken into consideration rather than the needs of, let's say, the traditional constituencies of the left, right? So the window of opportunity for left populist parties presented itself in a very clear way from 2011 onwards. And what they did was different from what the left traditionally did in two ways. The center left largely in the years preceding the crisis, accepted the neoliberal settlement, and basically has a discourse that is based on consensus and really like coming together as a society. And you see a lot of this even today, right? In Joe Biden's speeches, for example, it's all about reaching out to Republicans and governing from the center and avoiding the extremes and so forth. And the more, let's say, socialist or like Euro-communist left in Europe had a rhetoric that was much more anchored in the traditional working class. Now, the problem is economic transformations also produce social and political transformations. One of the consequences of embracing neoliberalism in the 1970s is that, for example, the unionized working class in almost every Western society has decreased its membership, which means that traditional working class discourses that appeal to people insofar as they are workers who are unionized and go to, and take part in the Fordist manufacturing economy doesn't work in the same way that it used to do, because it doesn't reflect the reality that a lot of people live in their as workers. So this is really like a key difference, for example, between like the traditional language espoused by the left in Spain and what Podemos did, right? Now, it's not just a question, to be clear, I'm not making the case that left populists simply need to talk in a more appealing way, right? That you somehow hit the key that resonates with people and that then you can win elections. You have to do that. It's very important. And a lot of times it demands breaking with the traditional instruction sheets of the left, right? You need to talk in a different way. You can talk about the people in a way that you pit the 99% versus the 1%. And it resonates with a larger group of society than if you say, we represent the working class or we represent the left, right? Because these categories have lost not analytical strength, but they don't convey to people the same way they used to convey 20, 30 years ago. The other thing you need to do, and this is a more of a traditional thing that the left used to do, is to organize. Because what we've seen with left populist movements, that you need to do a balancing act between these two things. Podemos is an example of a party that had a really good discourse in its first 2 years of existence. It was very nimble. They were very centered on political communication and driving the media cycle. But they never took very seriously the task of organizing at a grassroots level. They basically lived from the enthusiasm of a lot of people who saw them as being able to produce a very radical political change in a very short window of time. Now, when that didn't happen, they were left sort of stranded, right? Because then you cannot compete, absent that sort of initial enthusiasm, in a moment of populist mobilization. It's harder to make people vote for you or care for your agenda. So in this regard, I think you have to do that what the traditional left has always done all the time, which is to organize territorially, organize with people in the neighborhoods. In other words, like provide the social bonds that have been frayed throughout the last 3-4 decades of neoliberal governance. Now, balancing sort of discourse and organization is a very hard balancing act. And that is ultimately, I would argue, the reason why these left populist parties haven't gone as far as they were at some point expected to go. And I emphasize at some point because it's very easy now to say, well, look, Podemos is not the governing party in Spain. It's a junior party in a coalition. Bernie Sanders did not win the nomination. Therefore, this strategy hasn't worked. But the thing is, what needs to be taken into account is like this strategy came very close to working, right? So the arguments that it was never going to work need to be compensated with the fact that Bernie Sanders, for example, in late February was very close to winning the Democratic nomination. Now, you need to do a stronger effort of balancing these two things, discourse and organization. But I think you can't neglect the former just because you haven't won in the space of 4 years, which is, to be clear, an amazing challenge. I mean, it's not like anyone 6 years ago could have expected that a party to the left of traditional liberalism in the US or social democracy in Europe could come close to exercising power, right? Sanders almost won the nomination, and Podemos, besides competing nationally, also Podemos-backed mayors held some of the major cities in Spain, including Madrid and Barcelona. And so I think these acknowledgements need to be taken, these merits need to be acknowledged when discussing left populism. So that's the gist of the book. And if you think, I think we can now open it to questions, and I'll be happy to answer whatever you want to know.
Thank you, Jorge. Yes, I was going to say, if people want to unmute themselves to ask a question, please do go ahead, because that would be great to get a conversation going. So I have a question. It's probably a very naive question, but I was wondering, obviously we're talking a lot about right-wing and left-wing populism and how they compare. I think we all agree that right now it looks like right-wing populism is the one that's in the ascendant. What do you make of this? I mean, it's a very very simplistic question in a way, but do you think are there lessons that left populists can draw about how they might adjust their tactics in future to become more popular as well as populist?
I think, okay, the first thing is sometimes it's claimed that sort of right populists have been very successful and you need to be more like them and you need sort of like to make concessions to the kind of speech they do. Because ultimately they are good at drawing voters who are angry at the system, and even working class voters, right, who would traditionally vote for the left and these constituencies. So we saw a lot of this with Trump and the so-called like the white working class thing, right? Like white working class voting for Trump. Now, I think that needs to be like, I think that needs to be qualified a lot, because basically when you look at the actual policies that Trump does, they're not very different from the policies that a traditional Republican administration would do. His main economic achievement has been to lower taxes. Trump looked like he could have done a sort of like workerist, pro-white working class welfare chauvinist strategy at the beginning of his mandate. But then he just switched to, and if you look at most radical right parties in Europe, that is what they do too. The exceptions are like the for example, is an exception to that trend. But for the most part, these parties are like, they're not really interested in challenging the market logic as much as in suppressing dissent. And that's something that Polanyi explained very well in his idea of like how to come out, the different counter movements that could come out of the crisis of market liberalism, right? So he described socialism as, in a very characteristic way, as socialism is subordinating the market to the needs of a society. Fascism, on the other hand, was basically getting rid of that contradiction by getting rid of public liberty and freedom, right? Now, I agree with Chantal that it's not useful to call the radical right today fascist or even to compare events today to the 1930s. It's important to like know that we're in a different juncture. And so these things are not equal. But there's a similar thing in that basically a lot of their strategy is to wage sort of very fraught cultural wars on suppressed dissent from communities that they or minorities they view as an enemy, right? That is what ultimately makes radical right populism illiberal in a way that I don't think left populism is, because I think left populism can be reconciled with the tenets of liberalism that I find most appealing, which are not like market governance, but like the respect of individual liberty and so forth, right? So what they have to do is they have to take into account that it's not enough to just oppose, as Chantal said, the right on the grounds of morality, right? That the radical right is terrible, and that we don't like what they do, and that like Donald Trump is a very bad man, Cheeto president, and so forth. That is not really useful. It's useful to the traditional center left, but if you want to have like a strategy that works, you need to offer something more than just a no to radical right populism. You need to offer an alternative, and you need to acknowledge the fact that while the solutions that radical right populists provide are usually wrong and wrong-headed, the conditions that lead to their appearance are there, and they're not something to be neglected. So I think I would say like acknowledge that the situation that they're coming from is one that is actually a problem for a lot of people. In terms of the economic conditions, the cultural ones is a different story.
Yeah.
And then be sure to while you're critical of them, don't allow like your criticism of the right to become tacit acceptance of everything that the center does, right? Because then you're just in the same framework that we've been stuck in for the last 20 years.
Thank you.
I have two questions, if I may.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for a very interesting book presentation. I have two questions for you. One is, what is the future for the Bernie Sanders movement in the US, given his age? And number two, what is your view on the transition of the Labour Party in the UK from Mr. Corbyn to Mr. Starmer? I'm very interested in that second question.
Okay, I'm going to
maybe I can say something about Corbyn and
Yeah.
we'll speak about
Very
that.
good, thank you very much. Yes.
Well, it's definitively a setback, you know, the fact that there was much hope about the renewal of the Labour Party thanks to Corbyn. We did not, you know, I say we because I very felt you know, sympathetic to this movement. We lost a battle, but that doesn't mean that we have lost the war, you know, because I think that particularly it's interesting to see that a lot of young people who have been mobilized by, you know, the Corbyn. Of course, some people lost hope and know they left. They joined the Labour Party because they or Corbyn and know that is Starmer they've left. But I don't think that's the majority. And in fact, they are a lot of people who have decided to stay and to fight, you know, and to try to at least impede Starmer to go too much going back to the Blairites. So I think that they can really maintain, and by the way, I will say the same thing about Bernie Sanders, because after all, it seems that the impact of the Bernie Sanders movement has been to move Biden a little bit more to the left, you know, and I think that definitively this should be the aim of people not to fight, not certainly, I would say, not to leave the Labour Party and say, oh, we are disappointed. No, to fight. It's, I was saying, this is a war of position, you know, this is not something that you are going to, because you've lost a battle, then you are going to abandon the war. The war of position still has got to go on. What do you think, Jorge?
No, I would agree. What I say is I know much less about the Corbyn case, right? I mean, I know about it superficially, but I'm a bit worried of making any sort of recommendations or analysis because I'm just haven't followed it so much in depth. What I would say is I think the case of Sanders highlights a problem that that needs to be acknowledged in the left populist strategy, which is one thing it produces very strong identification with a particular leader, right? Now, as we've seen with the Bernie Sanders case, that doesn't mean that it's like, you know, Bernie has been accused of like running a personality cult or so forth, because like a lot of the people that supported him were very enthusiastic about his chances, right? And basically about his policies more than about Bernie Sanders himself. And what we've seen with the Bernie Sanders case is that does not necessarily need to lead to like a leader that is autocratic or that cannot manage pluralism. No, it's perfectly compatible. Now, the problem is that once the leader isn't there, then it's hard to recreate that feeling of common purpose, right? Because that leader, Chantal, as you and Ernesto Lacroix theorized, that comes to embody many of the demands of the different groups that support a political coalition. Now, the question is, like, Sanders is basically too old to run again, so he will not run again. I think ultimately
Jorge, there is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, like, ultimately, I think he has done. You know, while it's not the thing that you would want to do in the middle of the primary, I can understand why this would feel like something you grind your teeth while you do it. But I think he has correctly assessed that he needs to support Biden so that like there is a left faction that can grow within the Democratic Party, right? And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is probably the most famous case of like new representatives that have come up since Sanders' first campaign. So that's one thing I point out in the book. It's not just about Sanders, right? Like Sanders tapped into a movement that at this point is like larger than he is. And that has led to the election of, for example, Jamal Bowman recently in New York against like another very centrist Democratic incumbent. So basically points out to the fact that if you want to change things, you need to, like, the left populist strategy, like the discursive strategy works, but you also have to organize, and it's not going to happen in the space of 2 or 4 years. Like at some point we were led to believe, which is like a testimony to how successful these leaders were at the beginning. But you need to, it's you know, the Max Weber, the slow boring of hard boards, and this will be going on for a lot of time. So I think really what Bernie bequeaths is a faction within the Democratic Party that is clearly progressive, sometimes overtly socialist, and that is going to be a threat for the more centrist faction if they get primaried, And I think, it will be a few cycles before we see another Bernie-like candidate, right? But I think once that candidate shows up, one of the good things about Bernie is he had a very unique set of abilities. But one that was very much, or that I personally appreciate a lot, but I think has to do with his electoral success, is that he was not did not come across as a traditional lefty that speaks in, leftist jargon, or culturally sort of elitist or very baroque terms. A guy who's speaks very clearly in terms of social justice, and who can sound angry at the status quo without sounding like he wants to, denounce or attack anybody. And he did this in a very, it has to do with the very peculiar trajectory that he had, right? In some ways similar to Corbyn's, but I think less polarizing, maybe because of the way the US media ecosystem works. But so yeah, that's what I would say. But I would keep in mind that this is not going to be a change that takes place in 2-4 years, but that it needs to be systemic, and needs to be an effort that takes decades of organization.
So we've had a question about organizing. Somebody's asking whether you could talk a bit about organizing and tactics necessary to repair the frayed social bonds.
Well, here I can I can give I can talk about my experience as I would volunteer for both Bernie and Podemos. I'm not a professional organizer. I'm more of an academic. But I did participate in both movements, which is part of what led me to write this, having been an active participant. What I would say is the following. So some of these things are hard to recreate by a political party, right? When you look at what classic organizations used to structure left-wing vote, some of the things were labor unions, for example, right? Labor unions were not just a vehicle for workers to make economic demands. They were also key in the US, for example, in supporting the civil rights movement, in leveraging their weight for for a variety of political goals, for educating and socializing people. So in the US, you've seen for the last 4 years, there've been clear efforts to unionize certain parts of the workforce. So you've seen that a lot with graduate students, but you've seen that with the rise of wildcat strikes in southern states with right to work laws. So I think that is really, really an area that is very important to develop. Now, I'm not a labor activist, so I can only speak in very general terms about this, and I'm wary of giving very concrete advice. When it comes to the relationship between a party and its supporters, though, I think this is key. There needs to be a balance between new parties and movements do have to have a clear sense of political direction and their priorities, and they need to be effective at delivering these. But it is very important to keep your base mobilized and make them feel like they are doing something that is meaningful, right? And in order to do that, you have to give them some autonomy. This was, for me, I think one of the shortcomings of Podemos, which is basically it set its sights on a very vertical model of party leadership, which served to gain a lot of electoral goals in the space of 2 years. But once that was over, the people who had initially supported it, unless the party was winning electorally, didn't have much to do within it, right? So you need to start thinking about the things that parties actually used to do back in the 60s and 70s, which is have things like their own cultural infrastructure. So maybe have Jacobin Magazine does this, reading clubs, for example, or intellectual gathering points, or places where people can work with neighborhood associations where people get to share their complaints about public services in the neighborhood, the problems they have. To be involved at that very grassroots level is, I think, super important. And it's important for parties to be actually invested in that, not just to say oh, that's something that activists do and we do our own thing.
Sorry, unfortunately, we're getting a bit close to time. Perhaps we could just have some space for one more question, or perhaps two, if anybody has a question.
Hey, I have a question.
Hey.
Great, thanks for a very interesting chat. My question also kind of concerns organization, so probably a bit of overlap with the last two. But I guess in general, what are your thoughts on the role of extra parliamentary organization, organization outside of just purely electoral ends? I kind of asked that for two reasons. Firstly, because so in the case, I think I would be a bit more pessimistic about the state of the British Labour Party at the moment than others have said, purely for the reasons that it seems the movement has basically been gutted by the electoral loss. And no real organizational infrastructure seems to have like outlived that, because all of the eggs were put in that electoral basket. Like even momentum seems to be lapsing into infighting a bit now. And then secondly, and I think more pertinently, because of like, I guess the current like political and global context, right? It does seem like the coronavirus crisis is kind of the time where you would want some kind of left movement, I guess, embedding itself in the community, participating in things like mutual aid, for example. And also because of like, I guess it strikes me that the left in the US anyway seems to have almost been caught out by, I guess, how radical some of the demands coming out of the Black Lives Matters protests have been, that maybe wouldn't be the case if you had a left more, I guess, centered around the kind of extra parliamentary organization, which I guess you were talking about a little bit there, but just, yeah, your thoughts on that.
I want to say something, but Jorge also, but more from a point of view of theory, because for me, one of the characteristics of a left populist movement is precisely that it tends to articulate what you call the extra parliamentary with the more traditional. You know, I think it's completely wrong to believe, as some people, in fact, an important part of the left is only movimentist, horizontalist. You know, they don't want to engage into any kind of traditional politics. They say no, only movement. Another part of co will say no, it's basically only through the parties. And I think that the specificity for me of left populism is precisely to say we need to have a foot inside the institution and a foot outside. Absolutely crucial. And I agree with Jorge that one of the problems of Podemos is that they did not really manage to make that. But here, of course, one is people criticize them for having been going too much on the question of the electoral machine. But I mean, I think that's true, but on the other side, they were in a conjuncture in which they were forced to organize for the electoral machine, you know, because they've been faced with so many elections, so they needed to that. It's true that after that, they could have really tried to a bit recuperate, so they missed it up. No, but clearly, for me, you are absolutely right, it's crucial. I mean, I can't think of left populism if it's not having that articulation between social movement and the pure, more traditional form of politics.
No, I think it's, I think it's a very good point. It's one of the tensions of the strategy, which is that, I mean, for a long time, the left sort of convinced itself that, you know, there's no point in participating in elections because we will lose them, or we're marginal and we'll just do like movement, horizontalism, and so forth, will not participate in institutional politics. And I think like the electoral turn in the left in these years, I think has been very positive, because it has shown that like the left can win at certain points, and like it can advance much faster than we thought it could. Now, what is also equally true is that it brings in a set of, it's a structurally fraught relationship, because sort of you want to be autonomous from social movements, but also you need to realize that having vibrant social movements is what sustains you in the long term, right? Without them, it's really hard to compete against established parties more than one electoral cycle. And a good example of that is Podemos. As Chantal was saying, Podemos basically made, they did this model of like, look, we're going to do a vertical party, forget about like integrating social movements or whatnot. We'll do our own thing. We're good at doing discourse, and we will win the elections in the space of 2 years. And the thing is, they did not win the elections in 2 years. And I mean, this has happened, in fairness to them, in other societies, but mostly, for example, in Latin America, when you had in the 80s, massive state crisis and sort of more liquid society where there were not so many clear boundaries between occupational status, class, whatnot. So it's very hard to like break down all these barriers in the space of 2 years. Now, I think that original model by Podemos, in fairness, I think the problem was not the original model. It was that once it showed that it could only produce so much success, it was never abandoned, right? So after 2015 or 2016, Podemos should have said, look, we've tried this, we've made impressive electoral gains. In order to conserve these gains and to be able to make more gains the next time we have like a moment of mobilization, social upheaval against economic policies, we need to dig and have like civil society organizations that work with us. And in order to do that, we have to have a more like vis-a-vis relationship with them. We can't dictate our own terms and accept them to follow our lead. So what I would say is, like, it is that there's no correct recipe of how to balance these two tensions, right? But I think a lot of it has to do with, like, you need to do an analysis of the political juncture in which you find yourself, right? Is this a moment of heightened mobilization when people can be led to, like, electoral realignments can happen within a very short space of time because opinion is shifting very quickly, as has happened in Spain and the United States in the past? Or is this a moment when, like, public opinion is more sedimented, it's not a moment of high mobilization, and then we need to, like, actually, it's a war of position, war of maneuver thing in Gramsci again. And this is a moment where you actually need to be more embedded with social movements. I found very useful for this the late Irish political theorist Peter Mayer, who actually describes very well how parties in the neoliberal era have become totally detached from society, right? The only mediating function is media. So you have, like, leaders who are on TV all the time or on social networks, but the parties don't have really any social infrastructure. And funnily enough, like, Podemos, which is a party that, like, sought to combat neoliberalism, has become a party in this model too. It's a very media-heavy leadership, but it's not invested in social initiatives because it still retains this very vertical top-down bottom. But it's more of an institutional problem, I think, than a problem related to specific leaders, and one that is going to remain. So it's never going to disappear. You can only try and handle it with more or less care.
I think the final question that we have, I think, is going to have to be the final question. Unfortunately, we've got on the chat here really closely relates to what you've been saying. Do you see any difference between popular politics and populist politics? Because when you don't have a hierarchical organization, a leader, do you have a populist movement? Grassroots movements are popular movements, but they don't need to be seen as populists. I guess it. Yeah.
Right. I mean, no, it's a good question. And, like, sometimes it's you get into this discussion like, oh, well, is this really populist or popular? And it can be a bit can be confusing for me, like, the first. But what I would say is, yes, demands can be popular, but in the absence of a specific leadership, they often remain within civil society, right? You don't give them a political and institutional translation. Just to give you an example, in Spain, there is a movement that sought to stop people from getting evicted after the crisis. There was a real estate bust, there was a boom and a bust, and families were getting evicted all the time. Now, this movement, they did direct action tactics. So they would sit in front, they would not allow the police to evict people. At one point they borrowed from the political repertoire in Argentina, and they would do, like, sit-ins outside the homes of politicians who, like, supported the evictions and so forth, right? Sort of a bit, very activist, much more so than sort of overtaking the institutional left at the time, in the way that, Michael, you were describing about the Black Lives Matter movement, right? But garnering amazing amounts of social support. So, like, 76% of Spaniards supported their campaign at some point, right? Similarly with the which has been amazing in the uprising since the George Floyd murder in the U.S. is the degree of public support, much greater now than when Eric Garner was killed 4 years ago, right? That is an amazing difference. But if these demands are not expressed institutionally, politically, there's not a certain leader that comes across as embodying them, well, they tend to remain within civil society. But at some point, you need to consider, okay, you need to take the step to actually provide a political solution for it, right? Maybe that is the difference between something being just popular and being part of a left populist platform. Right. I don't know if it answers your question fully. To be honest, I also get confused with these, like.
Do I have time to say something, or is it too late?
Oh yeah, you could probably give a much better answer than me on this regard.
Okay, no, because look, I think that usually people who ask that question is because they have a negative view of populists. It's we are, and I know, for instance, in France, well, there is this guy who, in fact, François Ruffin, who is very much in defensor of, he's in La France Insoumise, he's one of the, people who more defend the idea of left populist, and people say, but he's somebody extremely popular, and people say, oh, he's popular, but he's not populist, he's not populist, because populist we told him bad. Well, of course, if we understand populist as something negative, derogatory, then you can say, no, popular is good, populist is bad. But if us, and I think that the position also of Jorge, who accept, you know, the discursive approach, a populist construction of political frontier is us against them. So it is establish a frontier. And popular doesn't really establish a frontier, you know. A populist movement is a movement that says we've got an adversary. I mean, for instance, what I found clearly, what was in at least the first campaign of Jeremy Corbyn, for the many, not the few, but our adversary is neoliberalism. We are against Blairism, so there was clearly a dividing line. Unfortunately, we are going to see what's going to happen with Skarmer. He said that he is going to follow the you know, basic idea of the campaign of Corbyn, but for me the criteria is, you know, do you really have as an objective to break with neoliberal hegemony from the point of view of left populism? You know, is there a transformation, a democratic rupture or not? If you are not a left populist in favor of a democratic rupture, then you are not a populist, because populism is precisely to say, you know, there are antagonism and we want to transform profoundly the relation of power. That is what the populist movement is, in left-wing populist, you know. It is different. Popular, there is no real definition of popular. You know, popular, you can be popular in many ways, but populist is something which has got much more of partisan character. You know, populist is partisan. Popular is not, no, nothing clearly, okay.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you. We've got a comment rather than a question saying that this person thinks that organising with the local state is also very important.
Yeah.
So that's just something we can percolate as we leave. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and thank you especially, obviously, to Jorge and Chantal for their time and for offering us plenty to think about over the coming weeks. Do have a look at your discount code on your Zoom invite and take advantage of that to read this wonderful book. It really is wonderful.
Well, thank you all for your questions and for being here.
Yeah, if people want to unmute themselves and we can just give a little round to the speakers, that would be lovely. No pressure.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank
Bye
you very
bye.
much. It's been a great evening.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye bye. Thank you very much.
Joaquin, are you a brother of Jorge or not?
My father.
I'm his father.
You are what? You are his father?
Yes.
Really?
Yes. And this is her mother, Berta. Berta is her mother.
Ah.
Berta.
For the family.
Nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
you.
Very nice to meet
We
you.
can't all have a drink together, but
Oh,
Sure.
okay.
Very nice. Very nice.
Okay.
Thank you
Bye.
very much.
It's a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.